Hello and welcome back to the class. Today I'd like to begin with a few quotes from various thinkers around time and history. This first is from Walter Bagehot, and he says, "A parliament is nothing less than a big meeting of more or less idle people." What does he mean by that? Does he mean that members of parliament or the legislative branch or any assembly that we know, he's calling them idle, that they do nothing? Take this quote from Mark Twain. He says, "Reader, suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress. But I repeat myself." Yes, we see Mark Twain here. He is not a fan of the legislature or assembly, as we will discuss in this chapter. Here's a couple more quotes. This one's from Sean Patrick Maloney, Democratic congressman. He says, "Congress is like first grade, only not as well behaved." Now, there is a separate video I'd like you to watch. I'm going to post that in the page below. But just take a look at that. It's just a collection of videos, a montage of the world's biggest political brawls. These are fights that have broken out within various legislatures around the world. Now, it's not something we think and associate legislatures or assemblies, as they're called in the title of this chapter. Chapter 14 in your textbook. Assemblies are those collections of people, members of parliament, members of Congress, any legislative body that agrees to vote yes or no on specific bills. These assemblies have differing functions depending on the system of government that they're in. Now, what are the roles of assemblies in general? No matter what system, whether you have a parliamentary system or a presidential system, what do the assemblies do? Well, there's a couple. Before we get into the details, just note that from here on out, when we refer to the term assembly, it's used to refer to both houses or chambers. This is going to be especially important when we factor in the idea of bicameralism, in which there are two chambers. Take the United States Congress, for example. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate. These two chambers together must pass bills, and collectively they're known as Congress, or the legislative branch. So when we use the term assembly or legislature, it's referring to both. Again, when we think of assemblies, we can also use them interchangeably with the terms legislature and the term parliament. And one of the key features of any political system is the relationship between legislative and executive authority. Think of the United States. What is the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch? That is something to be seen. Now, in a parliamentary system of government, as adopted by countries like Ethiopia, India, Japan, the UK, and more, when we think of the relationship between the assembly and the executive, we should see that a lot of the power flows back and forth between the executive and the assembly. When you are a member of the electorate or the voting body, the mass public, you choose members of the assembly, and in a parliamentary system of government, someone will be chosen from this group here in order to meet the demands of this group in the executive branch. So when we think of an assembly, imagine if the president wasn't elected by the public, but the president was elected by members of Congress. This isn't something unusual to us in the United States, but this is how it operates in a parliamentary system of government. So the parliament has a great deal of power. Moving on to presidential systems, we can think of the traditional notion of separation of powers. When we think of separation of powers, we see the assembly here very prominent. There is a judiciary that is separate and an executive branch that is separate still. All three of these branches of government get to exercise several checks and balances upon one another. This could include, you may have heard of, the presidential veto, the power of judicial review, and the congressional override of such a veto. So, when we think of separation of powers, it is attributed largely to the French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu. And Montesquieu, he came from an aristocratic family. He wrote something titled The Spirit of Laws, and he championed a form of parliamentary liberalism that was based on the writings of Locke. And he said that you would divide the powers of the government upon three branches in order to resist tyranny. You fragment government power. That way, no one branch will become too powerful. No one individual or small group can ever gain too much power on their own. And we see the system adopted in practice, in reality, by the United States, Brazil, Turkey, Zimbabwe, and more. So when we look at groups like this, thinkers like Montesquieu, we see that the systems that we have adopted, the institutions, the format and design of our assemblies and their relationship to other branches, it is something that is a choice, and that these choices give us tools to analyze just how successful these assemblies are or unsuccessful. So now let's get into the functions of the assemblies. Disregard this portion essay. I'll go ahead and delete that. Disregard that. Don't worry about that. So what are the functions of the assemblies? Well, number one, they can provide legislation. Assemblies create laws that will be seen as authoritative and binding. However, the assembly rarely monopolizes legislative authority. Take, for example, executives and other bureaucrats can often institute new regulations all by their own power. Take, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, which was established by Congress in the 1970s. Under the Environmental Protection Agency, we see that they have the power as bureaucrats to define what certain penalties are for businesses that are too polluting. And so when we think of legislation, we can see, at least in the United States, even though Congress does create laws, there are many opportunities for new rules and regulations to be implemented by the executives and the bureaucrats beneath them. So when we think about legislation in the United States, there is something to be said about the United States Senate and the challenge of the filibuster. Now, there's a separate video from Vox that I'm going to post. I invite you to go ahead and pause this video and turn that video on right now. But if you're still here and you're ready to go, if you've watched the video already, let me just summarize the major points. The filibuster is a rule created entirely by the Senate. It requires an override or cloture of 60 votes in the Senate. That's 3/5, a supermajority, if you will. Without that supermajority, any one senator can literally take over the ship of Congress. That's what the root of the word filibuster is. It's Dutch for pirate. And anyone can speak at great lengths in order to delay a bill or prevent a bill from even being called for a vote. So we see that this offers another challenge to members of the United States Congress when they're trying to figure out how to pass pieces of legislation. Now, the second function of the assembly is representation. Assemblies play a representative role in providing a link between government and the people. The power of an assembly is usually seen as an important consideration within a democratic government. And so when it comes to representation, we see that, take the United States yet again. The House of Representatives, these people are elected every 2 years, senators every 6 years. They go and try to meet the demands and get the way of what the people in a specific district or state, what they want, they're going to go out and fight for it in Washington, D.C. And so the people feel more represented, and they will try to elect people who they think will do a good job of representing them. Now let's turn to our attention to a third function, scrutiny and oversight. Here's a cartoon. I do not know exactly. It looks like the Boston Globe. It says, "Mr. President, you have a package from the new House Democrats." And basically a UPS driver is bringing this magnifying glass. What it signifies is that this is after the 2018 midterm elections in the United States. And the idea was, well, this new crop of Democrats, they will become elected. They will have the power of oversight, and they will be able to analyze and look into the details of the actions of the president. Now, the power of oversight belongs to the assembly, no matter which party is in power, which party is in control. This cartoon just merely highlights that once Democrats took power, it was to be expected that they would use their power of oversight even more greatly over a Republican president. So, assemblies have increasingly become scrutinizing bodies to deliver accountability. When we think of things like what can be done in order to block or challenge the president, that can be done in the United States. However, assemblies are not always effective in calling executives to account. Take, for example, in China, the assembly passes most bills unanimously, meaning what are they really doing as a legislative body? Are they truly listening to the will of the people or challenging the people in prominent positions of power, or are they merely a rubber stamp? Oversight of the executive requires that representatives to have access to research services and expert advice. This will be typically done in a committee system, and these committees can oversee various activities. Take, for example, the impeachment proceedings that took place in 2019 and the start of 2020. Members of Congress were trying to impeach the president over allegations that he made an improper request to the president of Ukraine. And so we see that this was to be expected when we think that the House does have power to analyze the phone calls, to try to find key witnesses. However, we see that in the Senate, the vote did not go in the Democrats' favor. Nonetheless, we see that the mere process of impeachment, it is something that belongs to this scrutiny and oversight idea. Number 4, this is going to be more important in parliamentary systems, but we see that the function of the assembly, they provide recruitment and training. Assemblies often act as channels of recruitment. They provide a pool of talent from which leading decision makers emerge. Think of Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential nominee. When we think of Joe Biden, he actually made his name known by being a senator for decades. And in the United States Senate, he was able to become a prominent figure in the mind's eye and making appearances on shows like Parks and Recreation. Really good show. But we can see that this allowed him to gain notoriety. And then he was selected to become vice president of the United States, and now he is vying for the presidency itself. We see that how did he get his name made? Well, it was by being successful in the legislative branch. Now, this is less true in authoritarian states and in presidential systems. In authoritarian states, we would say, think of North Korea, for example. They're totalitarian, but they are authoritarian by nature. North Korea, it wouldn't matter who's in the assembly, if there's an assembly at all, because that authoritarian rulership has already been decided. Who will be in power? That's been decided long ago. In presidential systems, we can see that even though Joe Biden is one unique example, it is not necessarily the only path forward. Think of Donald Trump. He had no political experience, no time as governor or member of the assembly, yet he was enabled to be president himself. So it is sometimes argued that assemblies corrupt politicians. How? It's by socializing them into norms and values that distance them from the needs of their constituents. When we think of members of the assembly, voters want to get them in. Voters want their demands heard. Once these members of the assembly or legislature are sent to their legislative bodies, then they have to breed new values like compromise, like exchange of deals and ideas. Like, if you do this for me now, I'll do this for you later. This is seen as a corrupting force, but nonetheless, it is to be expected in any legislative body. Finally, when we think of the functions of the assembly, legitimacy should not be overlooked either. The final function of assemblies is to promote the legitimacy of a regime by encouraging the public to see the system of rule as rightful. That is why, even in authoritarian and totalitarian states, you will see some semblance of an assembly. Think of China for their authoritarian way of life and their government. China, even though it is controlled by one party rule, the Chinese Communist Party, we can see that they still have an assembly in which people vote individuals into this assembly. All are members of the Chinese Communist Party, and yet they still have it. Why? Because it's kind of seen as a good thing. It kind of gives a way for the people to see, okay, my demands are being met, even if they're not really. So let's get into ideas of structure now. You may have heard of bicameralism and unicameralism. We'll go over both right now. Unicameralism is the principle or practice of having an assembly composed of a single legislative chamber. This is not the norm in many Western democracies. We can think of the United States yet again and see that we do not practice unicameralism. Yet, in places like Israel, New Zealand, and Denmark, we see that there is just one assembly, one legislative body who's doing everything, whereas in the United States, we have two. This is the principle of fragmenting legislative power. Bicameralism separates power into two co-equal chambers in the assembly. And we can see this utilized in places like the United Kingdom, United States, and Fiji. So when we think of bicameralism, we can think of the United States legislature. Here is a picture of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And there are literally two chambers in this building where the work of the Senate and the work of the House of Representatives are conducted. Even though you are a member of Congress, depending on which legislative body you fit into, you can go and seek out where you're going to go for work that day. Now, a couple things. The House, it has different term lengths than the Senate, and they represent specifically districts. These are smaller, more locally designed areas as opposed to the Senate, which represent entire states. So different constituencies are bound. And yet it's through this act of separating the legislative power into two chambers that allows these two chambers to represent, to oversee, to provide scrutiny and representation in different ways. Finally, the last idea of structure is the idea of the committee system. Most legislatures or assemblies use committee systems to carry out detailed consideration of legislative measures and financial proposals. They have the power to scrutinize government administration and oversee the exercise of executive power, and ad hoc committees may be created to investigate matters of public concern. Ad hoc meanings built right there on the spot. So in case if there's a specific, unique challenge that needs to be addressed, a committee can be formed right in that moment to address it. So take several of the standing and permanent committees in the House of Representatives and the Senate. There is a committee on agriculture, appropriations, armed services, the budget, education, and more. In the Senate, there's also a budgetary committee, an armed services committee, an agriculture committee, an ethics committee. We see that these committees are comprised of smaller groups of the senators and members of the House. These smaller groups get to carry out a lot of affairs for the larger legislative body that they're a part of. So we can think of the 2005 testimony of Rafael Palmeiro, former baseball player. He testified before an ad hoc committee, which is in the United States called a select committee, on the allegations of steroid usage in baseball. See that even though there is no steroid usage in baseball committee, one can be created. This is a select committee. One can be created to carry out and get members of Congress to see and analyze, is there any action that needs to be taken by members of Congress? I'm going to post this clip in a separate link. This is the 1999 video of the Senate Appropriations Committee, in which Michael J. Fox, star of Back to the Future and other shows from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, in which he fought for funding for Parkinson's disease. At the time, he was probably the most famous person that had this disease known as Parkinson's, and he went to testify before a committee all about his cause, with the goal of Congress becoming more aware of what this disease is and to better fund many research and development programs. And finally, we can look at the 2019 House Judiciary Committee, in which members of the House of Representatives asked Corey Lewandowski, former advisor to President Trump, on all of his activities in relation to the Mueller report, the report on activity between Russia and the United States government. So I'm going to post these videos separately. You can take a look to see how some of these committees operate in practice. So why committees? Remember, committees, senators can be one of 100 people. And if you had all 100 people yelling at each other, trying to get their way, not a lot would get done. But if you can break these groups down into 7, 9, 11 people, then you have a better chance at getting things done. And so the committee system allows a wider range of views because it gives specific categories, gives specific topics of prominence, and members of Congress can be assigned to the appropriate committees in which they are seen as empowered to do so. This can lead to fuller debate because rather than everyone talking over each other, committees can meet in smaller groups to get into the details a little bit more than had this been a public debate with hundreds of people. And it can encourage decisions to be made more efficiently. It also divides labor, encouraging expertise and specialist knowledge. Meaning, you wouldn't want to be on a committee of the agriculture, a committee on agriculture, if you're from the representative from San Francisco or the tech economy in San Francisco. You wouldn't know a lot about what to deal with, but you would want to probably be on various technological committees, business committees, things like that. And we can see that you would have a lot of advantages that way. Some disadvantages: it encourages centralization by allowing a chairperson to dominate proceedings. In fact, if you are the majority party, the party that has a majority of seats in the respective chamber, you get to dominate proceedings because these chairpersons are led by members of the majority party. So majorities play a key role in divvying up power. It can also lead to a narrow range of views and interests because if the chairperson or people close to the chairperson want to get things done, they could have some tools and strategies to get their way heard more frequently than the opposition. So let's focus on the last topic of the chapter: performance of assemblies. What do they do? Well, we can look at assemblies as policy-making bodies, policy-making assemblies, which enjoy significant autonomy. They have an active impact on policy. They basically pass things, and then it's up to the executive to either sign that into law or reject it. There are some assemblies that are more policy influencing than they are policy making. And we can think of certain legislative bodies which can transform policy, but only reacting to executive initiatives. Think of a parliamentary system. If the prime minister doesn't want to get something done, then they're going to have a very tough go of it. Finally, executive-dominated assemblies which exert marginal influence or merely rubber stamp executive decisions. We can think of the assemblies in China and North Korea yet again to see that these decisions are largely made already by the executive. The assembly just kind of fulfills the role that the executive has tasked them with. So there you have it. We see assemblies come in many shapes and forms. They have certain characteristics, but we should be ready to analyze these assemblies and see just how they can play a role in our understanding of political science. That's it for this video. Go ahead and follow any instructions that need to be followed, and I will see you one more time in the final chapter of the semester very shortly. Take care.